we go.
All right, so good morning again, everyone. Today we're going to talk a little bit about some principles of heredity. We've already read and annotated a little bit, so hopefully a lot of this is not new for you, but it'll hopefully make more sense since I had you read it first this time. So just a quick introduction. I like to make sure that I clarify these two terms. Human characteristics such as our eye color and hair color are passed down from one generation to the next. So these are factors about ourselves that naturally we can't control. Now, obviously, there are ways to alter it from a sort of a synthetic standpoint, but naturally speaking, those factors and traits are things like your eye color you have no control over. And so by definition, heredity is the transmission of genetic information from parent to offspring, okay? Now that is not to be confused with genetics, okay? A lot of the times we use these terms interchangeably, but they're often used incorrectly, interchangeably. Heredity is...
Mute your mics.
Heredity is when is the actual process of transmitting or passing down genetic information from parent to offspring, whereas genetics is a branch of science, okay? Genetics is the science that studies heredity, okay? So going forward, I definitely want you to make sure that you're using these terms properly. Let's see, this is 103. Then you might take like anatomy and physiology, but your next course that might be coming up is 311, which is genetics. You will take a whole genetics course. So we won't go into a whole lot of the fine detail that you probably did see in your chapter, because you're going to take an entire course on genetics in another semester or so. But it is the science that studies heredity. And this is a very important branch of science because it allows us to, again, sort of study and understand why we are the way that we are. We're able to predict things. We're able to just see a lot of things. What we'll see by the end of this lesson, based on Gregor Mendel's work, is that we can use genetics to, again, forecast things or predict. Like inheritance happens in sort of this predictable pattern, okay? So we can use this tool, use it as a tool to be a little proactive when it comes to our health and managing diseases and so forth. I do think that sometimes we kind of cross that line between genetics and medicine and natural occurrences. Genetics, the science that studies heredity, we're studying both genetic similarities as well as variations within a population. One of the things that just came to my mind was genetic testing. These are some sets of tests that women can do while they're pregnant in order to basically determine if the child is going to be at risk for any diseases or illnesses. I think, and this is just my personal belief, that to me, that's a bit much. Science sometimes is a gift and a curse. Again, just based on my personal beliefs, I opted, not to do genetic testing when I was pregnant with my kids because, I didn't want to know. Some people, opt to do it because, to me, if you find out something that you don't want to find out, then it leaves you to make some decisions. Okay. And a lot of women, and I'm grateful for the right to do it. I just opted not to do it. But, you can test for, predispositions for diseases and syndromes and things like Down syndrome and all of that. You can do some testing early in your pregnancy to determine, I guess, if you want to continue with that pregnancy. And I didn't want to be faced with that dilemma, but that's one of the ways that we can use it for our benefit. Like if you do genetic testing during pregnancy and you find out that your child is going to be, born with this abnormality or that abnormality, then you do have, you have the right to make a choice. So, I think it's...
Isn't that type of testing expensive?
It is expensive. Most insurances may or may not cover it. But again, I think it's kind of twofold. That it's good that some people know themselves and they might feel like, okay, I'm not going to be able to be the parent that's going to have a child that's going to be a quadriplegic or, this issue or that issue, and you know, they can choose to terminate or whatever. So it can be expensive. Yeah, and then I think it can lead to a whole lot of other, you
I
know,
said,
issues.
you must be, you must not be, you must not have no car.
Okay. So yeah, I do think it's quite expensive, and genetic counseling that comes with it. So you do the testing, and then you also, you basically have a session with like a genetic counselor to help you, um, you know, receive the results and understand and interpret what those results means as far as, you know, the likelihood of something happening or not happening. And so when we're talking about heredity, you know, this transmission of information from parent to offspring, due to the work of Gregor Mendel, we know that this concept of inheritance happens in a very predictable pattern. Okay, so we can, you know, again, we do our DNA analysis and so forth, and we can sort of predict the likelihood of, you know, an offspring being born with, you know, blue eyes or brown eyes. Like if we see that mom has the gene for brown eyes and dad has the gene for blue eyes, and, you know, you crossbreed, you know, those, we can predict the likelihood that the child is going to have, you know, which characteristics and so forth. And we're going to look at these concepts right now today, like about the concept of dominance and recessive, and, you know, homozygous versus heterozygous. So these are very simple concepts that I do want you to walk away with today. So in studying inheritance, much of what we know and believe to be true about patterns of inheritance is credited to the work of Gregor Mendel. And so Gregor Mendel was a monk who bred pea plants. Okay, so, you know, these plants are seeds, and, you know, you can do all these crossbreedings, and you can study the outcomes of these crossbreedings. If you breed, you know, one plant type with another plant type, we can sort of, you know, watch these patterns of inheritance over, you know, time, and better understand these concepts. Okay, so he conducted a series of experiments over a number of years, and we now hold his findings. We sometimes refer to them as Mendelian genetics. Okay, those concepts are, you know, applicable to most breeding patterns. Okay, and so I like to start this conversation just kind of defining some terms. Okay, the first term is gene. Okay, these are some very important terminology in genetics, so go ahead and make sure you're taking notes right now. The gene, all right, you've heard about genes before. You hear people say, oh, it's in your genes. Okay, it's your DNA. Okay, but when we're talking about genes in the context of genetics and inheritance, we're talking about an inherited factor. We're still talking about a segment of DNA, but this factor is determining a very specific characteristic or trait. Okay, so for example, again, the hair color that I talked about earlier, or your natural eye color. Okay, these are specific traits or characteristics that are controlled by a gene, a specific gene. Okay, and so because, you know, you've seen, you know, various traits amongst other populations. Again, we'll just use the eye color. We have blue eyes, brown eyes, green eyes, hazel eyes. That's because genes can come in different versions. Okay, and those different versions of the gene, we'll call it an allele. Okay, and so we might use those terms interchangeably. Okay, so alleles are different versions of a gene that are still controlling a specific trait. Okay, so the eye color example, the trait or characteristic itself is eye color. Okay, but the allele is a version of the gene. Okay, that's going to determine what your eye color actually looks like physically. All right, so make sure you can, you know, intelligently distinguish between, if I said a gene or an allele. They are essentially the same thing, but the allele is just emphasizing the fact that this is the gene that's determining this particular feature, but there's different versions of that gene to determine what you actually, how that feature is actually manifested. Okay. And so Gregor Mendel had done a lot of crosses where he was trying to examine the outcome of the seed shape, for example. That's a trait or a characteristic that he looked at, the seed shape. Okay, it's determined by a gene. All right, and the possible outcomes is that the seed could have this round shape, or it can have this wrinkled shape. Okay, so he did, a number of crossbreedings, and, again, just collected the data on what the outcomes were. Okay, so the shape of the seed in this case is the trait that's being controlled by a gene. There are two different alleles, okay, for this gene. One that's going to encode, the round seed, and one that's going to encode the wrinkled seed. Okay, so that's a concept here that we want to walk away with, understanding that depending on the version of the gene that you inherit is going to determine the physical trait that you manifest. Okay, what that trait looks like in you. That's what that means when we look at you. Okay, and so, continuing with some terminology, let's look at this word locus, okay? And so all alleles for a particular gene will be found at a specific place on the chromosome that we'll call a locus, okay? So in our last unit, we talked about, cell division and, chromosomal makeup in humans and so forth. And you know that we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, okay? And I mentioned the Human Genome Project before, where we've sort of mapped the human genome, and we know, what genes that are coded for which factors and where they're found on which chromosome. I had showed you that a picture of a karyotype, okay, which was basically the layout of all of the chromosome pairs, right? So we know on which chromosome can we find which gene, and then we know which gene, we know what traits are controlled by, particular genes. And so the locus, okay, the locus is the specific place on a chromosome that will find this gene, okay, that's responsible for that trait. Okay, so all alleles for a particular gene will be found at a specific place on the chromosome that we'll call the locus for that gene. Okay, there's a specific place, okay, on the chromosome in the pea plant that determines, again, the shape of that seed. Okay, this is one of the, again, the factors or traits that Gregor Mendel examined in the pea plants. Okay, so the locus tells us exactly where on the chromosome that we can find that particular gene. All right, and so when we're, studying patterns of inheritance, there's this concept of a genotype and phenotype, okay? In your notes, write down that your genotype is simply the set of genes that you have, okay? Your set of genes is your genotype. The set of alleles or genes that an organism has is said to be their genotype. Okay, and again, we can look at your genotype, your set of genes, okay, to determine a lot of things about you, okay, to predict a lot of factors and traits and characteristics about an organism by analyzing their genotype. Okay, and so we talked about the allele earlier, right? The allele is a version of a gene that's going to determine a trait. An organism with two identical copies of an allele is said to be a homozygous pair of alleles. Write down that term, homozygous. Okay. I used the eye color example. So you have two alleles. You'll inherit all alleles in pairs. All right. And these pairs can be either the same, homozygous, or they can be two different copies, heterozygous. Okay. And then we'll look at the concept of dominant and recessive to determine, okay, you have two different allele combinations for this one trait. Which one would you end up manifesting? That's going to be based on that concept of dominance and recessive. And we'll look at that in just a second. Okay. But for right now, we're just talking about your set of genes. The set of genes that you have that makes up your body is your genotype. Okay. Each of those genes will be inherited in a pair of alleles. Okay. You can have two identical copies of an allele, which is a homozygous pair. Homo, that prefix homo means same. And then you can have two different copies of an allele, which we'll call a heterozygous pair, different. Okay. And so if we kind of keep running with that eye color theme here, we have an individual right here that has inherited two different copies of the allele that's determining our eye color. Okay, so individual A has a heterozygous pair of alleles for eye color. Okay, individual B has a homozygous pair of alleles because they are both two brown alleles. Okay, we'll come back to that concept of dominance and recessive in just a moment, but I want you to, make sure you understand those terms. And so that's our genotype. Those are the genes, sort of the behind the scene factors. Now, what we see physically, our outward manifestation of our genes is said to be our phenotype. Okay, so write down the term phenotype. The phenotype of an individual is the outward appearance of, characteristics. So your physical traits, okay, what you actually look like. This is what we see when we look at you. We don't see your genes or your genotype. We see your phenotype, which is the outward manifestation of your genes. Now, I like to highlight here that, in terms of learning and concepts and definitions, I always remember phenotype with the P for phenotype and P for physical, like those physical features. But it doesn't stop there. Your phenotype also includes behavior and function, like how you actually look and function, okay, is considered your phenotype. So physical features, physiological features, behavior features, all of those are a part of your phenotype. Okay, how an individual actually looks, how we behave, all of those are a byproduct of our genes, our genotype. Okay, so we have our genotype, which is a set of genes, G and G, genotype and genes, and then we have our phenotype, physical features. Okay, and so the point we're making here is that our phenotype, okay, what we look like physically, write this in your notes. Your phenotype, for the most part, is determined by what? Someone.
The genes.
Genotype.
Your genotype. Okay, your genotype. Okay. But here's an important concept that I want you to grab. You only inherit genotypes, alleles. Okay, only the alleles or the genes are inherited. You do not inherit a phenotype. Okay, does that make sense? So when we're talking about factors that are passed down from generation to generation, you're inheriting genes, not features. Okay, so if I asked you some type of true or false question or whatever, excuse me, whatever, you inherit a genotype. You do not transmit, I do not transmit my physical features down to my child, but I transmit my genes, okay, onto the next generation. So make sure you understand that concept, okay? Don't get tripped up by that. So even though someone might say, oh, you look like your mom, or you look like your dad, oh, you got your nose from your dad. Well, the feature itself wasn't passed down, but you got the set of genes from mom and dad that resulted in, what you look like physically. All right, and so then we have the concept of dominance and recessive. Okay, this is still in context with the alleles, all right, the genes. Okay, so a dominant allele, all right, remember I said you can inherit, we inherit alleles in pairs, all right, and so that combination of alleles can either be dominant, one can be dominant, one can be recessive, two dominant, so forth. So the concept of the dominant allele is that of which we would observe, okay? The dominant allele is the form of the trait that is observed in the phenotype. That's the one that we're actually going to see. So if we have a heterozygous pair of alleles, okay, two different alleles. So we'll go with the eye color example. We have one allele that's going to code for blue eyes and one allele that's going to code for brown eyes, okay? If that individual, if I'm looking at you physically and you have brown eyes, but I know looking at your, genetic analysis that you have the allele for both blue and brown eyes, but I look at you and I see brown eyes, then that tells me that the dominant allele in that pair is the brown allele, because you actually have brown eyes. Okay, so by definition, the dominant allele is going to be the form of the trait that is observed in the phenotype, what we actually see when we look at the individual. In contrast, the recessive form of the allele in that pair is the form of the trait that is masked or repressed. Okay, we use the term repressed in genetics, okay, to refer to sort of the absence of the trait. Okay, so when we have the concept here that we're learning is that when we have a heterozygous pair of alleles, okay, two different copies of an allele, the allele that's going to be manifested or observed in the phenotype is going to be the dominant form, and the recessive form will be masked or repressed. And so the only time that we see a recessive allele, the trait that's encoded by the recessive allele, the only time we're going to see that trait present in the individual is in the absence of that dominant trait. So that basically means that you're going to have a homozygous pair of recessive alleles. Okay, so again, if we have a trait of interest, and this trait is coded by a recessive allele, the only way that trait is going to be observed in the phenotype is that you have two copies of that recessive allele. Okay, so the concept is that the only time we see a recessive trait in the phenotype is in the absence of the dominant trait. Anytime you have a heterozygous pair where you have dominant and recessive, the feature that you're actually going to see is going to be that of the dominant allele. Okay, that's a very important concept. When two alleles of a genotype are different, so two different alleles, heterozygous, only the trait encoded by the dominant allele will be observed in the phenotype. All right, so let's look at an example of that. We're still with our eye color example. Let's just look at individual A. This is a heterozygous pair of alleles. And then we have a legend up here that tells us that the allele for blue eyes is recessive and the allele for brown eyes is dominant. So if we look at individual A, their genotype is a heterozygous pair of alleles for blue or brown eyes. If we looked at this person physically, would individual A have brown eyes or blue eyes? Anyone?
Brown.
Brown eyes. Why, Jada?
Because the dominant gene is brown. Well,
Yes, because brown is the dominant allele in this pair. Did we all see that? Individual A would have brown eyes, okay? This is a heterozygous pair of alleles. So this individual could theoretically have blue eyes or brown eyes, but because brown is the dominant form of the allele here, this person is going to have brown eyes. All right, let's look at individual B. Okay, you do need to be able to interpret something like this in the future. Individual B, we have a homozygous pair of brown alleles. What color eyes would individual B have?
Brown eyes.
Brown eyes. Why, Christian? Couple reasons that are quite
because both of those. I mean, the brown allele is dominant,
Right.
and it's dominant in both of the.
Well, one, the dominant allele in this case, well, brown is the dominant allele, but also because really there's no other option here. This is a homozygous pair of alleles. So regardless, this individual is the likelihood of them having any other eye color is very slim in this case.
Very unlikely.
But to answer the question, yes, because brown is the dominant allele, and then we have a homozygous pair of alleles for brown eyes. Okay, so your outcome is likely that you're going to have brown eyes. All right, individual C, we have a homozygous recessive pair of alleles. What color eyes would this individual have if we looked at them?
You gonna have blue eyes, man.
They're gonna have blue eyes. Why?
Because blue is more dominant in the gene.
Well, you can't say that in this case because the legend tells us that the blue allele is a recessive allele, right? But the only time we see the trait from a recessive allele is in the absence of that dominant allele. And so that's why this person will have blue eyes, because we have a homozygous pair here, which both alleles are blue. Okay, so blue isn't dominant in this case, is actually the opposite. The dominant form is absent. And so we see the recessive form. Does that make sense, guys?
Yes.
Okay. So we good on we got three very important concepts right now before I go any forward. We talked about the difference between a gene and an allele. Okay, you definitely need to be able to distinguish between gene and allele. We talked about the concept of genotype and phenotype. And then we just talked about the concept of dominance and recessive. Okay. What questions do we have before we keep going? Okay. Any questions?
No.
All
No.
right. All right.
ma'am.
So let's look at a couple more concepts. Okay. The concept of dominance. I just kind of alluded to it a little bit before, but write this specific concept down on your paper. The concept of dominance. Okay. The concept of dominance tells us that when two different alleles are present in a genotype, okay, so that heterozygous pair, only the trait that's encoded by the dominant allele is observed in the phenotype. That's the concept of dominance in genetics. The concept of dominance tells us when two alleles are present in a genotype, only the trait that is encoded by the dominant allele is observed in the phenotype. What questions do we have about the concept of dominance? Does that make sense to you all? If I ask you to describe it or identify it, could you?
Yes.
Okay. Good.
Dr.
Uh-huh.
London, I had a question.
Yeah.
Will we have to fill out the charts for this section, the gene chart?
In Connect?
Yes, ma'am.
I haven't made the assignment for that chapter yet. I have to go through and look at them when I'm done lecturing. Because right now, only thing I asked you all to do
Yes,
was
ma'am.
read and annotate.
I have a question as
And it has
well.
the rest of the grades for the homework being put in there also.
They haven't. They'll be put in this week because grades are going in for midterms this week, so everything will be completed soon. Grades go in Thursday.
Excuse me.
Uh-huh.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
This is Jada. You told us to email you in regards to if we missed the midterm, and I emailed you I think the day of because I was in Birmingham and my power went out, so I wasn't able to take it, and I emailed you, but I don't think you seen it to
I
email me back.
responded to the class as a whole that if you missed the midterm, I opened it back up. Did you not get that email?
No, ma'am, I didn't.
Okay. So the opportunity to make it up was on Friday. I sent an email to the class that I opened it up for another window for those who had missed it. So we can talk about this after we get done with this today. Okay, Jada?
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So you were asking about the Connect. Yeah, I haven't gone through to select which questions I want you to answer just yet in Connect. Okay, guys? All right. All right, the concept of dominance. All right, so that's dominance. All right. And so anyway, you know, you probably, as you were reading, you saw that Gregor Mendel, he basically conducted a number of different tests and crossed between various parents to examine the outcome of a particular trait. So he did these monohybrid crosses, he did dihybrid crosses, and, you know, studied the potential outcomes from crossing, you know, a parent with a particular trait and or two parents for a particular trait, one trait, okay, and observe the possible phenotypic outcomes in that, you know, first generation of offsprings. All right, so let's look at some of the concepts that we know to be true now about patterns of inheritance based on Mendel's study of inheritance, okay, or his based on those experiments for crossings. We talked about a little bit in our last unit about this concept of crossing over and how, you know, different combinations of sister chromatids and chromosomes are distributed during meiosis, during reproduction, and so that kind of happens in a very random fashion. So the principle of independent assortment tells us that, you know, when those gametes are formed, okay, during meiosis, right, the production of those sex cells during meiosis, that process of crossing over and the distribution of those chromosomes are happening at random. Okay, so there's no, you know, rhyme or rhythm to why an individual inherits, you know, the allele for blue eyes versus an allele for brown eyes, or, you know, like that. Okay, so when gametes are formed, alleles of different genes separate independently from one another, and it is a random assortment of genes. Okay, therefore, you know, the allele that one gamete receives does not influence the set of alleles that another gamete receives. Okay, that's that principle of independent assortment. Okay, all of this is happening at random. We have absolutely no control over it. Let's look at, so we're still in genetics. We're still talking about how things happen as far as the transmission of information from parent to offspring. And so one point we'll look at is this sex chromosome, sex determination, okay? For the most part, our genes are the most important sex determinant in eukaryotic organisms. And when I'm talking sex here, I'm talking about gender, okay? The genes are the most important determinant in eukaryotic organisms, okay? So your sex or your gender is generally determined by your sex chromosomes. Okay. Now, in some cases, environmental factors can exert some kind of control over an individual's sex, rarely. Okay. But typically, members of one sex have a pair of sex chromosomes. Let's look at what those combinations look like. You should have heard this before. Okay. The female sex contains 2 X chromosomes. So we're looking at the sex chromosomes right now. We're not talking about our autosomes anymore that determines our other features. Now we're talking about those that determine sex, and we call those our sex chromosomes. So females, the female sex contains 2 X chromosomes. So we're talking XX, okay? If you're looking at a human karyotype and we got our pairs of chromosomes, 1 through 22, you know, they're out in pairs. And then at the end, we have our sex chromosomes, and you see the XX, that's going to tell you that that individual is a female. Okay. The male sex has 1 X chromosome and 1 Y chromosome. So XY. Okay. You're looking at that human karyotype. You got all your chromosomes laid out, and then we see the XY at the end. Okay. If nothing else, if you can't tell anything else from that human karyotype, you should be able to tell me that that individual is male. Okay. So you should definitely know the setup for the sex chromosomes. XX is female, XY is male. Now, we're clear that things do happen. There are some abnormalities. There are cases where individuals can inherit patterns that deviate from what's considered normal. And so when we speak in genetics, we use the term normal. When we say in a normal female, she will have XX. In a normal male, he will have, you know, XY chromosomes. Okay. So what do we need to know about these X and Y chromosomes? The first thing you need to know is that the Y chromosome is responsible for over 95% of male specific characteristics. Okay, so the Y chromosome is going to contain the genes that determines your maleness, the things that make you a male, okay, meaning things that you find in a male that you don't find in a female. Those traits or characteristics are going to be coded for on the Y chromosome. So think reproductive organs, the penis, the scrotum, things of that nature. Those are going to be coded for in the Y chromosome. Okay, and so we don't see those features in females because we don't have the Y chromosome. Okay, so in your notes, you're indicating that the Y chromosome is responsible for over 95% of male specific traits that you only find in male individuals. Okay, now on the other hand, the X chromosome, as it should be a little bit more intuitive now, the X chromosome contains genes that are required for both sexes. Okay, and so remember when we're talking about genes, this is DNA, right? So we're inheriting, our DNA is responsible for us being able to function. It encodes what our bodies need to function, and so there are genes on that X chromosome that are required for both sexes, male and female. And so what that means is that the X chromosome is required for life. Okay. If an individual, you know, a child or a fetus will not develop if for whatever reason, you know, during meiosis and that crossing over and that fertilization, if there's no X chromosome in that mix, that fetus will not develop. That is not a viable organism at that point. The absence of the X chromosome is lethal. Make a note of that. And it should make sense now when you look at your sex chromosome combinations, we have XX in female, which that X is present, and then we have XY in males. So the absence of the X chromosome is not viable. A fetus with a Y chromosome and no X chromosome does not survive. Okay, an individual with only one X chromosome with no other X or no Y, they will survive, but they will have some defects, okay? But they will have the overall appearance of a female. Now, again,
Isn't there a decline in the?
I'm sorry?
I was asking, isn't there a decline in the Y chromosome? Aren't there more XX parents than XY parents now?
I don't know if that's true anymore. I think women used to be the predominant species, but I don't know the data on that anymore. I think that used to be true though, that women outnumbered men. Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know how true that is anymore. I don't know if it's balanced out at all yet. But so we're saying that the absence of the absence of the X chromosome is lethal. The Y chromosome is responsible for, you know, those male specific characteristics. But we're also saying that, you know, this XX and XY happens in our normal ideal situations, but there are cases where things happen and we observe abnormalities, like an individual can inherit an extra copy of a chromosome, okay? And more is not always good. So if an individual inherits like two, I think Klinefelter syndrome is one that is XXY. And that individual can have an extra chromosome and still present as a male, even though there's two X's present. So there are situations where things don't happen the way that they should. Like Down syndrome comes to mind when I say inheriting too many or too few. Okay, so we know that in a normal human, so I use that term normal, we have 46 chromosomes, okay, 23 pairs, right? But sometimes an individual can inherit too many or not enough. Down syndrome is the case where the individual inherits too many, okay? Chromosome 21, I think. They have 3 copies of that chromosome instead of the 2 that they should have, okay? And so that's gonna lead to genetic abnormalities that, in the case of chromosome number 21, that person will have Down syndrome if they have too many of chromosome number 21. They have 3 instead of 2. All right. So let's look at 2 more concepts and then we'll be done. I know we're about to run out of time. Incomplete dominance, write this down. so we talked about that concept of dominance and recessive earlier. Well, of course, there's always exceptions. In this case, incomplete dominance tells us that dominance isn't always, complete. It isn't always absolute. And so incomplete dominance is when the phenotype, okay, what we physically see, the phenotype is an intermediate between two parents, okay? So in this case, we're using a red and a white flower. That was kind of a great example that I saw. A red flower being crossed with the white flower, okay? All of the F1, the first generation of offsprings from that breeding, are gonna be pink, okay? So the intermediate, if you mix red and white together, you get pink, okay? That's the concept of incomplete dominance. In this case, neither one of those traits, the red or the white, were considered or considered to be completely dominant. And so our first generation of offsprings from those parents, from crossing those, breeding between those two parents are going to produce pink flowers in this example. Incomplete dominance, when the phenotype is an intermediate between that of the two parents. All right, that's incomplete dominance. Now let's look at this other concept, codominance. Okay, you should have read about codominance. Codominance is when there's simultaneous expression of the phenotype of both parents. Okay, so the offspring is not going to be a mixture or an intermediate between the two, but you're going to see the simultaneous expression of both parents in the offspring. So in this case, we have the white camellia and a red camellia, okay? So that F1 generation is going to be a combination of both red and white, not pink, as we saw with incomplete dominance. Incomplete dominance, we have the two traits in the parents where the offspring is gonna come out as kind of an intermediate or a mixture of the both. But the offspring's feature is not one of either of the parents, okay, but kind of a mixture of both. Whereas in codominance, co meaning simultaneously, we're going to have these F1, this first generation of our offsprings being exhibiting traits of both parents. So we're going to have a mixture of both white and red in this offspring. Not that intermediate that would have been created, but you're expressing the phenotype of both parents. Exactly. Okay, so this is codominance. All right, so you should definitely be able to, describe the difference between incomplete dominance and codominance and identify it. If I gave you a picture or a scenario or some kind of description, you should be able to determine which concept I'm referring to, incomplete dominance or codominance. Now, in as much as the things that we've talked about are true in a normal case where our genes determine these particular traits and factors, I have to put a pin in that and say that it's not just the genes alone, okay? Our genes are the most likely contributor to factors and traits, but the environment also can play a role in shaping our phenotype, what we look like, okay? So in your notes, this is a true fact, okay, that genes interact with the environment to shape the phenotype of individuals, okay? So while we, in general, we say that these things are determined by our genes, it's true for the most part, but there are cases where environmental influences, environmental factors influence what we look like physically. And an example of that, we see it in hydrangeas, and we call this concept a norm of reactions. So while, again, we know that our genes are going to code for a particular trait, when we factor in environmental factors or influences, now we have what we call a range of possibilities of what that phenotype might actually look like. So the norm of reaction, write that term down. The norm of reaction is the range of phenotypic possibilities that can develop from, a single genotype when we factor in environmental conditions. So make sure, again, you understand that if we inherit a particular genotype, we know, what this phenotype should look like physically. We know that this gene codes for this particular trait, this gene codes for this particular trait, that gene codes for that particular trait, and this is what we should see in the phenotype. Well, when we factor in environmental conditions, we now know that we can actually have a range of phenotypic possibilities. All right. The hydrangea is a plant. Okay, these plants, if you plant these seeds, they all have the same genotype. They all have the same genes. Okay, but you've probably seen various colors of the hydrangea flowers. That is because even though these plants, these seeds are of the same genotype, the actual color of the flower can range from blue to pink to kind of this violet shade, depending on the pH of the soil. So that's the environment, right? You plant seeds in soil, in an environment, and depending on the pH of that soil, these seeds are all the same. They're genetically identical, okay? They have the same genotype, right? But depending on the pH of the soil that you plant those seeds in, the flowers can have a different phenotype. And so we call that the norm of reaction, when we actually take into account the impact of the environment on the actual phenotype. All right, that's our last concept. I'm going to stop here. What questions do we have? What questions do we have about this?
No,